So at the end of class last week, we had this little food and ingredients array, and I wanted you to use JavaScript to output it this way, which probably a few of you did. I know from my emails, at least a few of you did, and a few of you probably didn't. So anybody who got this working, how would we output this? I want to go through this. I said you would need to use a couple loops. Okay, we will need console.log, but we're probably going to need loop first, right? Because we're going to want to output this data this way. Jake?
You'll need a loop within a loop.
Okay, yep, we will. So let's do that. So what kind of variable do you want to use, and what do you want to loop? Tell me what this should look like.
Int I.
Okay, well, we actually would use var. If it was Java, we would, but remember our variables aren't typed.
Yeah.
Okay, so I, yep. Where do we want to start I?
0.
Yep, okay.
I is less than
Yep.
4. 3.
Okay, so, well, which?
3.
Less than 3, okay, yep.
I plus.
All right, so we'll increment I. So then what are we going to do inside of here?
So do foods or system.out.
What will be the JavaScript? It's not system.out. Karpanth, you mentioned it. What's the commit? Yeah, so we'll use the console.log. So what do we want to output first? So again, our output's got to look like this. We want a food, and then within it we want the ingredients. So how are we going to get that element? Okay. Okay, well, let's try that. Let's just try it like that and see what...
We'll come back.
So that's what we get, right? So we get the full array.
I and then also 0.
So let's try it like that. So for the first row, we'll clear. Okay, so that's good so far, right? Because we're just getting the name of the food. That's what we want. But what else are we going to have to do after each food, Amanda?
Create a variable.
Okay. What variable name do you want to use?
J.
All right.
And it's equal to 1.
Okay. Why is it equal to 1 rather than 0?
Because we're not using the first index, we're using the second index.
Right, because we want to omit. We've already output the names of the foods. We want to start at the first ingredient. So index 1. Okay. And when do you want to loop until?
Foods, I, dot length.
Oops, sorry, so J. Yep, so for the subarray, okay, and then how do you want to output these?
Console.log. There's a tab plus tab plus tab.
Okay, we can just put in a single tab.
Yeah, plus foods. And then I and J.
All right, let's try that out. So that's what we want. We get our food, and then we get an indented list of ingredients. Then we go to the next food. We get our indented list of ingredients. Now, there are a few different ways you could do this. This isn't the only possible solution, but this is basically the result we were looking for. So 2 nested arrays. The first time we're only concerned with index 0, and then for each one we're concerned with all of the other values starting from index 1 until the end.
Just for the first for loop, it might be a better idea, just like we did, just like you mentioned, for the length of the array. You may want to put that in there instead of a hard-coded value, because what if we wanted to add to this array, right? It gives us more flexibility when we don't add a hard-coded value like that, right? So
how could we replace that 3?
Food stuff.
Yep. So we could try it. Clear, and we'll get the same result, right? So now that's dynamic. If we add more foods, we don't have to recode it. Completely dynamic. Both loops are dynamic.
one more thing for this one. Does anyone know, and this is the kind of, I didn't ask this in the first class, but I'll ask you now. Is this a great thing to do in the for loop declaration? Is it good to do foods.length? I'm talking about from a performance perspective. No. Is it? The answer is no, actually, right? If we were to take foods.length out and we declared a length variable, right, as an example, before the for loop, right? So let's say we said length is equal to foods.length, right? Because every time, even though it has a property, right, and we put length in there, right, as opposed to foods.length, would it work the same, right? It would. And you know why it's better? Because every time I do a foods.length, I'm doing a calculation, right? So I'm doing a calculation every iteration. Now this is okay for a small array like this size, right? But what if my array was like thousands and thousands of lines, right? Or my data was really huge. As an example, I was reading from a file, and I'm reading like JSON data, right? And it's really big. It'd be totally different. So this is actually best practice to unload, you know, kind of the declaration of your for loop, and by putting a static variable in there instead of something that's going to be calculated every single iteration, okay? Just as a best practice. The other thing is that you want to also count, the other thing you can do is sometimes what we do is we count up in the array in a for loop a lot of times. And we found when we, from a computer science perspective now, going back to that, it's often better to count backwards. I know it kind of sounds weird, but it's easier for us from a performance perspective. If you actually look it up, if you actually subtract as opposed to add, that's another little tidbit there. It actually is a little bit more performant than if you do it the other way around. So again, no calculations, like even the second for loop here. We could probably do something different here, but what can we do here that's different? Because our our foods I is always going to remain the same. That's static, right? Once we get that information, we need another variable in there, obviously, other than length, right? Or we could reassign the value of length, you know, or add some kind of other length variable in there. But again, we're doing that calculation over and over again, and it's also indexing. This is even worse. The second for loop is even less performant than the first one, right? And again, you can't tell because we're not metering anything, right? I can't meter how much it's going to take in terms of milliseconds of response time, right? But we do this in a very succinct way when we use things like C# and Java. We can meter how long it takes from a time perspective. We can measure the time it takes, right? Now imagine we're operating JavaScript on the browser, right? Which is even, so we have got latency from the browser and there's latency from our code. So just as a thought, do I expect you guys, or does Rich expect you guys to do optimization like this? Absolutely not. The only thing we care for is that it works right now, all right? But it's not bad to understand what's going on. Okay.
Anybody else? Any questions about our code up here? I've enabled a solution. Again, this is just one version of it. I think it's slightly different, but it's here if you want to see that code. Okay. Let's have a look at assignment 1, which is now up on Blackboard in 2 parts. If you go into the assignments tab, you'll see part 1 and part 2. So the document is attached to part 1, and we'll go through it. So part 1, which is 20% of your mark, is due in 2 weeks, and the rest of it is due a week after that. So you have 3 weeks to do it. This will take you a while to do, so we've broken it up partly so that you can't leave the entire thing until the end. Okay? We're going to force you to get you started and give you 20% of your grade sooner. It's 15% of your final mark, and you're going to use Express, which we're not going to get into this week, but we will next week, to build a personal portfolio site. So you're going to use Express.js and the EJS templating engine. We'll go over those things next week. Okay? You also have to deploy your portfolio to a live cloud service, and I've given you some of the services here. We'll look more specifically at Azure next week. You have free access to all of these. Okay? I've given you a couple links to a few student portfolios. So here's one of them. So Andy graduated a few years ago. Now, in terms of design, don't be intimidated. Both of these were web students. They weren't programmer students, so they did quite a bit more design work than you do. So I don't expect this in terms of this kind of quality in terms of the overall design. But in terms of what should be on the portfolio, in terms of content, these 2 sites should give you a pretty good idea. They're also both responsive so that they will work and scale to tablets and phones. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about the easy way to do this today. Okay, so those links are here. So you basically need a 5-page portfolio. You can have more than that if you want. So at minimum, you need home, about, project, services, and contact me. So you'll use the templating engine called EJS, which we'll work with next week. It really lets you build pages really quickly. And the Express framework, we're going to use the Express generator. What this is, it's basically a scaffold. So rather than you having to hand code every character in your application, the scaffold pre-builds a lot of stuff for you. So when I run it, when I run the Express generator, it will actually give you, here's a sample. Whoops. It actually builds out all these folders. I know some of them may be hard to see. So all of our view templates will go here. It will build out images, JavaScript, and style sheet folders. So this whole directory structure is already here, as well as a site configuration file. So we just run the generator from the command line, it pre-builds this stuff, and then we can customize and add on to it. So you will have to use, you may need JavaScript, you'll have to use some CSS, and we're going to give you an easy CSS tool that you can use, or you can do your own. We'll talk about that. So we've recommended that you use Twitter Bootstrap. We're going to spend maybe a half an hour today playing around with it. How many of you have used Bootstrap before? Okay, so some of you have some familiarity with it. So you don't have to use Bootstrap. If you want to do all the CSS yourself, that's fine. If you want to use another CSS framework, that's fine. Bootstrap is recommended just because basically all the components are already there for you and we can just plug in and use it. It's less work at the end of the day. So we've laid out what pages you need. You'll need things like a header and footer, common header and footer for layout. We'll want documentation, so things like proper meta tags with your file name, author's name, file description, section headers for your CSS declarations, that all your variables make sense. You're not calling your variables variable 1, variable 2, variable 3, where you're using them. And any sort of appropriate comments. You don't have to get carried away with comments, but you shouldn't be giving us a portfolio with no comments at all. We'll want to see that you're using GitHub for source control. Okay, so you'll have to include links to your GitHub repositories. Now, if you've signed up for the GitHub Student Pack, then you will have access to 5 private repositories. Because this assignment is for marks, it would be a good idea to use a private rather than a public repository. So another student can't just go and look at your code and take your stuff off of GitHub. Okay. Now, when you make them private, it also means we can't see them. So how does this work? Well, if you make a private repository, if Brad makes a private repository, in order for Tom and me to have access to it, although I'll be the one grading them, you basically have to add me as a collaborator. So you just have to take my GitHub username and add me to the repository. GitHub sends me an email and says you've been added to the repository. And our GitHub links are here on Blackboard. I think I put them up inside of tools and resources. Yeah. Here's my GitHub, main GitHub page. So there's my username, and Tom's is down below. So you just have to add mine or both of our usernames to your private repository, and then we have access to it. Nobody else will. So part of the thing we're going to evaluate is that you're making regular commits. So part of the idea of putting your code on GitHub is that you won't lose it, right? And that you have archives in case you break something. You can always revert back and pull out an earlier version of the file. So if we only see that you've committed one version to GitHub, well, you won't get full marks for that. We want to see that you're making regular commits, you're working on the project and pushing it to GitHub. So if you lose your computer, your house burns down, you haven't lost your project.
And we talked about that last week, right? When we went over the whole Git tutorial in the first part of our class, right? How to make commits, how often to make commits, which is probably every major change is what I recommend. I know that Rich was saying at least once a day you should probably make a commit, and that you have to build up your workflow when it comes to how you build your project.
We also want to see the site running live on a cloud server. It says here using Git. That's the easiest way. So one of the nice things is that most cloud services let you deploy automatically from GitHub. You can still use FTP, the way you did with PHP files, and upload them to the server. But generally with cloud services, you can connect your website to a GitHub repository, and the cloud service will monitor that repository, so every time you make a new commit, it automatically gets deployed, and your changes go live automatically every time. Okay. Well, that's what we would recommend. Okay. You have several opportunities for bonus marks for the ambitious among you. If you want to implement AngularJS on the front end, we'll be doing that in Project 2. But if anybody's got a good handle on it and they want to try and tackle Angular early, we'll give you bonus marks. If you get the contact form working, so it will actually send an email out, and that's functional, we'll give you bonus marks. But you have to code that yourself. You can't like use a service that will write a contact form and do the email for you. That's not the idea. The idea is you can program the contact form using Node to work. If you want to do external documentation, so things like page wireframes, an explanation of your technologies, and a visual style guide, which in a production application for an end client, you would probably produce, we've made that an option. If you take the time to do it, we'll give you bonus marks for it. The other thing that you can do is run, and I would recommend you do this, it's not a requirement, I would recommend that you should run your site under an actual domain name. So if you use something like Azure, if Jake uses Azure, he's going to have a subdomain. It will say, jakesportfolio.azurewebsites.net will be the URL. If you run it at jakehoven.ca or jakesportfolio.ca and you show that you've learned how to attach register a domain name, point it to a server and get your site running there, we'll give you bonus marks for that. And I encourage you to do it. Many employers have said they want to see that you guys know how to do that, how to register a domain name and get a live site pointed to it. So not a requirement, but it is advisable. And with your GitHub student pack, it includes, I can't remember which the provider is from, it might be Namecheap.
Yeah, it's Namecheap.
Namecheap is giving you 1 year of a domain name for free. So it doesn't cost you anything anyway. So you may as well take advantage of that, get your name, and then you can post your portfolio there. So here's how we're going to mark it. You don't have to submit a zip archive on Blackboard. All we really need is the link to your GitHub repository and a link to the live site. We can see the code on GitHub. We can test and run the site online. So you don't have to upload anything to Blackboard. Right? So the biggest part is the site structure. So using the Express framework to generate out a proper Node application. So it will build out these folders for you, but then you're going to work with them and put everything in their proper place. So that's half of your mark, a few marks for the visual interface, a few marks for the performance, the internal documentation, so site header, comments, 4 marks for version control, 4 marks for deployment to the cloud. A couple of things on here I want to point out. Don't get too carried away with part 1. Okay, as I said to the class this morning, the idea is not to have you up at 4 o'clock in the morning searching for the perfect shade of green to use in your footer. That's not the idea. It's only 10% of the mark. So yes, you want this to look good. You want to be able to show it to somebody who you're asking to hire you, but don't get carried away. It's not primarily a design project. We're primarily, you're evaluating your ability to use Node and Express. Okay, and the marks are structured appropriately. What we want to see, so of these 4 marks here, and half of your Git and half of your cloud mark, basically 8 of the marks are due for part 1. So what I want to see for part 1 by October 7th is you have to have started. You have to have an Express site that you've committed to GitHub and deployed to the cloud. Doesn't have to be finished. It can be incomplete, but we want to see that you at least created the shell of the site and you've got it on Git and you've got it on the cloud and that you're working on it. Okay? And then the final submission is we want to see the final product. So you basically just post the 2 links twice. So here's part 1, here's my link to where I'm at so far. Here's the GitHub repository so you can see how far I am with the code. Here's the link to where it is so far on the server, half finished, part way finished. And then you'll just, the next week, just resubmit the same links. Okay, so we know that it's done. So all you have to do is submit 2 URLs twice. Right? So you can leave the whole thing to the end. You don't have to submit part 1, but you're punting 20% of your mark. Right? That's 8 marks of the 40 is for making sure you have at least a beta site up and running online in 2 weeks. And then you have an additional week to finish it. 20% late per day is the late deduction. Okay. You can use some third-party code with these conditions. Okay. So if you're going to use code from somewhere else, you need to make a comment as to where that code came from and what it does. Okay. You also can't copy the entire application, only 10%. You can find features, oh, I like this functionality, I want to use it from here, that's fine. You can't take someone else's entire site and submit it to us, obviously, as your assignment. Okay. And if you're not sure at all, then you should need written approval. So say, hey, Rich, I want to use this code, here's the link, here's what I want to do, is this okay? So as long as you tell us where it's coming from, that's going to be okay.
So I'm going to ask Rich the same question I asked him earlier today, which is, okay, Rich, I'm going to act like the interviewer. Rich, is it okay that they use your code that you show in class for their assignment?
Yes and no.
Okay, what's the answer?
What's the yes and what's the no to that?
What do you guys think? Class, the code you see in class. So if we put some code up, can you use it? Which parts can you use, which parts can't you use? Well, if we show you our portfolio site, if I show you my portfolio site and you take it and use it, that would be bad, right? That would be a bad thing to do. But what about things like, we're showing you the Express generator. Can you use that? Yeah, we're asking you to use it. How about just Node and the stuff that we see from our training information? That's okay. If we tell you what to do, and if we put it in our PowerPoint slides, probably it's okay, right? Again, if you're not sure, you can always ask Rich for this part. And for me, we're going to the same disclaimer is going to be on my assignments in the second half, right? So if you're unsure about something, ask. You can't get into trouble that way.
Does everybody understand what it is we're asking you to do?
Can we just look at one more site? Remember that we did that last time? I don't know if you still have it.
It's awards.
The award site. It's AWWWRDS, right? Awards, 3 W's, yeah. If you just look for that, that should be good. I'm not sure if it's org. Is it org? It is. So the award site here, and if you look for a portfolio, right? Actually, there's some really good examples of portfolio sites and different things up here. Now, these are super sites, right? These are sites that have been there. They've submitted themselves to be reviewed by these award site, which is kind of like a review site for different websites. So don't worry, you don't have to be like this. But the great thing about this is, and again, I use it in my own work. We have I do this web design stuff on a regular basis now. We use it to say, so what do I like about this? Do I like this? What piece parts do I like and not like? So this is one way of kind of getting an idea of what you want on your site that's doable. Okay, keep it in mind that it has to be doable for you at your level. Number one. Second thing is things you don't like. Don't include the stuff. You sit there and go, that's an eyesore. Like, don't include that in your site. You don't want that. So it's some good places to get ideas. And the other thing I kind of caution the class in the morning is, maybe it's a good opportunity for you guys to put together a plan, because this is a larger kind of assignment. Even though it looks 15%, looks kind of doable, small or whatever, and we've done these 5-page sites before, right, with maybe different names. Instead of projects, it's products. Most sites are like that. If you actually look online, the majority of sites are like these some variation of these 5 pages that we've asked you to do, right? Put together like a little wireframe, a drawing. Whether you draw it by hand or whether you use some tools, and there's lots of tools out there that help you wireframe, to kind of put together a plan for yourself before you do any coding, right? Or before you actually do anything with HTML5 and CSS or Bootstrap. Draw it out and see what you want to try and get, and then aim for that, right? And if it's undoable, if it takes you a long time to draw it out, or if you find yourself drawing lots of wireframes, you're doing too much. Because remember, it's only worth four marks out of 40, right? Your front end, the way it looks, right? Focus on your functionality. That's what this thing's about. I just want to reiterate that, because some people find themselves writing themselves into a coding hole, right? Like a black hole that they can never escape from, right? We don't want that. So don't bite off more than you can chew on this one. Do a little bit of a plan for yourself, and that's why, if you go back to the assignment, Rich, that's why there's this optional section there that says, hey, you can do a little design document or a style guide, right? And optional site features C, right? And you can get a few marks for it. So if you're going to do some planning, right, submit that so you can get some bonus marks. This is a great opportunity for you guys. And like Rich said earlier, it's what the industry demands. It's not something that you can do. You can't just go write a website these days for small to medium-sized business and say, here it is, bye-bye. Right? You need to give them something. You say, okay, guys, in your next iteration of your website, here's your style guide. You can pass this on to the next design group, or maybe for you, you're going to take it on. You can look at what you did last time to understand as a visual representation of what you did in the last revision. Okay?
I may even have something like that. So this would be a fairly sophisticated example. This is 29 pages, but of a style guide. You know, what kinds of things, so it would be describing these kinds, so these are the kinds of things, if you're going to do this, that would be in here. Let's see if we just scroll down here. So here would be a sample style guide some students did for a project they did for the engineering department, so they talked about logo usage, sizing, what colors would be used, what fonts. So this is really helpful for clients to have, right? Because then they can take this, let's say we do something on the web and they like how it looks. Now they want to use that identity to do print material. They, we've built a new website. Now they want their business cards, they want their brochures, they want their letterhead to now match what we've done. We've given them all the information that they need in order to do this. You know, how are we going to do headings? This is also really helpful. This is kind of like, just like comments are professional courtesy among programmers, style guides are professional courtesy among designers, right? We're going to take over a project because we have to make design changes. Well, it would be great if whoever designed the current site application, the current brand, gave us this, that our client had this, so that we could take, and we're not guessing and trying to reverse engineer all of the designs and styles. We have a document that outlines them all. You know, in terms of the plans, so here they've done mock-ups, what it's going to look like. So these students figured out what this application, they mocked it all up before they ever built it. So they weren't trying to make design decisions about where things should go and what it should look like at the same time they were building it. So they did all of this work ahead of time.
That's why it's so important. Imagine you're working with you're not on your own. Like right now you're building your own little portfolio site, right? And it's going to work with Express and Node. Okay, fine. But what about in the future? Especially on your project, you're going to do a group project for me, right, in the second half. Imagine not having any plan, right? And both of you're trying to figure out what to do, right? What to come out with. It's really challenging when both people don't have any kind of plan. So, although it's not mandatory, I highly encourage you guys to do this optional piece. It's another thing that that'll help you as a web developer and even as a software developer. Because even on the software side, we still do design documents. I do a lot of game development as well, and I'll tell you right now, we have game design documents, right? A GDD, right? No matter what we do, there's some kind of documentation we can refer back to and say, hey, what was the plan? Here's my plan, and here's my output. Here's my plan, and here's my result. Here's my estimate, and here's my actual, right? I want to be able to compare the two, right? So it's a really good way of doing things.
Is there anything you're not clear about in terms of what you need to do and what we're asking for?
I'm going to be the interviewer again. So Rich, I really like the fact that it's broken up between these 2 weeks. You don't have to submit the whole project 3 weeks from now. That's a really good thing. It's going to motivate you to start early, and I highly encourage you guys to do that, because this one, it looks like a very straightforward one, but truly God is in the details on this one. Normally we say devil's in the details, but we're going to avoid that. God is in the details on this one, guys and girls, right? If you don't start early, you're going to get hammered, right? So please start early on this one. Make sure you have your first submission by week 2, and then it'll help you get moving, so that by week 3 you're ready to go, and that you're not behind or late. Any other questions or concerns around this one? This is one for you. This is a portfolio builder. This is what you're going to go into an interview with. If I'm an interviewer and I'm a web developer or I'm hiring web developers, and I want to see what your work is like, I want to see your portfolio site. I want to look at your GitHub. I want to definitely look at your coding. Show me your code. I might even do a test. I might even say, show me what you can do. Solve this problem for me. And then I'll talk about behavioral stuff or whatever, right? But at the end of the day, this is just another piece Because even though we're developers, we still got to show nowadays, hey, this is what I can do. Here's proof that I can code, right? I did this, right? This is one example. So make it your own, right? And like Rich said, you don't have to make it perfect in this iteration. This is an iterative approach. We're going to build on this one, right? You're going to start off with one, which is, you know, the minimum viable product that you're going to produce, the MVP, if you will, right? Produces minimum viable product, like Rich has put in here from a rubric perspective. It's kind of outlined nicely here. And then as we go forward, we can build upon this, especially on the second half, okay? I think that's it for the assignment.
Okay.
Maybe you want to stop recording and then.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
So we should take a quick look at, we'll probably spend maybe half an hour or so. We should have a look before we dive into Node at Bootstrap. So again, we've recommended that you use it. We're gonna use we won't really use Bootstrap today, but we'll be using it in all of the Node files that we do. To give you a kind of a quick sample of what it looks like when you guys do your enterprise computing class, which would probably be next summer, very likely with this guy. We tend to use Bootstrap in that class, just for laying out and formatting. I know a few of you are already taken the class. So here is a simple application we built in COMP2007, which for those of you who haven't taken it, you'll be taking it in your fourth semester here. So we've used Bootstrap just for basic styling. So things like our forms, buttons. So all of the classes, you know, here we've got a table, striping, and the hover effect. All these things come from Bootstrap.
And it's not really coming out here on the display.
No.
But if you actually watch the video, you'll see that the striping looks pretty good.
So for those of you who have used it, what else can you tell us about it? Why would you use it? Did you like it? Did you not like it? What are the reasons to use it or reasons not to use it? Tyler, what do you think?
Super easy. Takes like half the time out of it at least.
Okay.
Okay, yep. Anybody else who's used it?
It makes making a responsive site pretty straightforward.
Why could it be bad if you use Bootstrap? Right, I'm gonna be the advocate, huh?
Did you get lazy?
You get lazy. I like your thinking. How about this? And I said it earlier today in the first section, which is, that's the second section, right? Which is, it looks very bootstrappy, right? Just like WordPress looks very WordPressy, right? We don't want to make a site that looks like every other site, right? So it's great from a rapid application development to use Bootstrap to shore up the holes in your CSS knowledge. You're not a CSS guru. Bootstrap gives you superpowers, right? Is it great to use just Bootstrap and that's it? I don't think so. I think, in my opinion, in a real world scenario, you probably want to use your own custom CSS. What about for our assignment number 1, right? Use Bootstrap, right? Why? We don't have time, right? You're learning a skill. Although front end is good, you're going to get responsive design elements in there, so it's responsive and it works well across platform, right? But you know, what we want to focus on is the objectives of assignment 1, which is learning Express and Node, right? So in this particular case, Bootstrap is a good fit.
So we'll use it for the assignment. We'll use it through class. So rather than us spending time writing our own CSS, define our own classes, we'll just leverage what's here. Okay, so Bootstrap's been around for a little while now. Originally it was developed by a developer at Twitter. So he developed it for use at Twitter, and then they decided basically to release it as an open source library so anybody can use the Bootstrap CSS. So it basically saves it for people like me and probably most of you. We want to be building functional applications. I'm not really interested in spending hours and hours playing around with CSS. So rather than writing my own, I'll just plug Bootstrap in and use Bootstrap's CSS. Okay. So what I want to do is we'll just build a simple HTML page and we'll play around, have a look at how Bootstrap works and play around with a few of the classes. So for example, here was the page we built this morning. So we built a simple nav bar, and we built a login, username, password with a button. So we just implemented a few of the classes in Bootstrap. So I want to kind of do something similar. So if you can open up a code editor, any editor, doesn't really matter, anything you're comfortable making an HTML page in. So if you're on the lab computers, you can use Expression Web, you can use brackets, you can use Notepad++, you can use Visual Studio, it really doesn't matter. So I'm just going to use Visual Studio because that's kind of where I'm comfortable. So I'm just going to go in and make a new HTML page. I'm going to strip out a few things which I don't want here. Just gives me a basic HTML template. I'm going to take that out. And I'll just save this one as a bootstrap test. It's just an HTML file. So actually, I'm going to do it a little bit reverse of how I did it this morning. Let's put on a little bit of basic HTML, unstyled. We'll see how the page looks in the browser, and then we can add some of the bootstrap classes to reformat our page without really modifying the HTML.
And are you using Visual Studio Web Essentials, Rich?
Yeah, I can't.
I don't know if you do. You have it in.
No.
Download it quickly. It's 18 meg, right? I'll show you I'll show you some shortcuts.
Okay.
Actually,
Well,
what
that's
I'm going to do for you?
you know what?
Or
I'm
no
just going
time?
to go ahead. Yeah, not so.
All right, go ahead.
So I'm just going to put on a navigation bar. We'll put on a few links. These will just be, so I'll just call them link 1, link 2, and link 3. So no styling at all. We just got a nav section with a nav bar. Up in my title, put on Bootstrap sample page.
Now you guys should be all familiar with this. This is like basic HTML. Is anyone not cool with this? Please put up your hand. Okay, you're afraid. It's okay to say I'm not comfortable with it, but this is like the basic of the basic. Rich is just going to put in some basic elements here.
We'll just take a quick look. All we should get are the 3 links. So notice, by default, as an unordered list, they're stacked vertically, which obviously isn't going to work very well as a nav bar. We're going to want those links. We're going to want those links to move this way. Be nice to give it a background, which you can't see, but we can change that. And we'll throw a simple login form on there too. So I'll put on a label and an input box. I know this is familiar to everybody because we did all this in Intro to Web. So I'll put on a label and input for username. I'll put on a label and input for password. And we'll put a submit button down at the bottom. We'll also add a type attribute, not that it really matters. And maybe I'll just put a heading up here in H1 that says login. Okay, so there's no styling. This is just plain old HTML. You guys have built a million HTML forms in the past. Nothing new here. So all we added was from lines 10 to lines 26, nav bar and a form. I'm just going to jump back to my browser for a second. We can have a quick look at it. There's our lovely page. Not exactly the world's best nav bar or form, but that's what it should look like with no CSS whatsoever.
Actually, this reminds me of pages from the 90s, right? They look just like this. There was no CSS.
That's right. So what we want to do is we want to use the Bootstrap style sheet so we can implement some of the classes that Bootstrap offers, and we can kind of get a sense of how they work. So we have a couple of choices. Just here, I can leave that up, I think, so you can see the code. So to find Bootstrap, if we just want to look for it, so the URL is getbootstrap.com, the world's most popular mobile-first CSS and responsive CSS framework. So notice it says mobile first, so that's important, right? We need to design with mobile first in mind because more and more of our users are on mobile devices and fewer of them are on desktop devices. So we've got a couple of options. If I click on the download button or and notice it's responsive because my window shrunk, you don't see the nav bar. Here's my navigation. So getting started also takes me to the same place. So we can download it if we want. So this will give us a local copy of the CSS files and JavaScript that comes along with it. Or we can actually use the CDN. What is a CDN? And why is that an alternative to actually downloading the files to our local machine?
We can include the CSS code from another domain.
Yeah, the CDN stands for Content Delivery Network. It's basically a cloud service that makes those files available. So we can simply link to them. Rather than having to download them to our machine, we can use those links. So they've given us 3 links here. So the first one is to the minified, so the stripped down version of the Bootstrap CSS. They also have a Bootstrap theme, and they have a link to a Bootstrap JavaScript file. And that file also is going to require jQuery. So we can copy and paste it out of here. However, I've made this a little bit easier for you. On Blackboard, if you go into your week 3 folder, lesson 3 folder, I've given you those same 3 links, but I've given you one extra one, which they really should fix. So here are the links to the 2 Bootstrap style sheets from the Content Delivery Network. Here's the link to Bootstrap's JavaScript, but the Bootstrap JavaScript, if you try to run it without also including the jQuery library, you're going to get a JavaScript error. So the Bootstrap JavaScript also requires that we have, I think it's at least version 1.3.
1.1 or yeah, 1.3. Actually, it'll say it right there.
It should tell us.
Yeah.
I'm surprised it doesn't.
Doesn't matter.
So we need to have that link as well. So the easiest thing to do is just copy that entire section out of Blackboard. Copy that whole thing to your clipboard. Where should this code go? We want to link to the Bootstrap CSS files, and we want to link to the Bootstrap JavaScript as well as the jQuery. Where should these things go in our document? Okay, we could put them in the head. So I could just paste them there. Now that'll work. For best practices, we should split this up. We should actually move some of this code to another part of the document. We'll work this way, but it's advised that some of this stuff goes somewhere else. What should we move and why?
How about you guys over here? You haven't said anything. Where would we move our code? What's the other option? So I've got CSS here, and I've got JavaScript and jQuery. Where should part of this go? Some part has to stay in the head. The other part can move. Which part can move?
CSS typically will keep where it is.
Yeah. The
Yeah,
JavaScript,
where do we want to move those JavaScript lines, and why should we move them?
to the body?
I don't know
Right?
why.
And where in the body do they typically go? The top, the middle, or the bottom of the body? Nope. Oh yeah, right after the form. So typically they go before our end body tag. They don't have to, but there's a benefit to moving those JavaScript links down to the bottom. Why might it make sense? What's the advantage of moving them down there? Still work in the header, but there's a benefit if we move them down here. What do you think?
What D? D, you know the answer to this. We kind of went over it.
Sorry.
See, I'm picking on people now because you guys are too quiet. Let's go.
So why would we move these out of the header and move them down to the body?
I just know that this is the best way to do it.
Yep.
But for that is maybe the script is run after the page.
That's
load,
right.
right?
That's
Something
right.
like that?
Exactly. If we load the script in the header, the scripts need to connect to the CDN and load first before this HTML can get rendered to the page. So if these scripts are really long or we have a slow connection to the CDN, the page is going to be slow to render the output. By rendering the HTML output to the browser first and connecting to the link second, this part's invisible, so the user doesn't see this. So this doesn't slow down our HTML output. So the page will render faster, potentially.
Remember that when the browser is reading the stuff that you're putting into the page, right, it's reading it one line at a time. When it goes to fetch the libraries, right, if it's big libraries of like JavaScript or jQuery, as an example, right, it's going to take some time for it to read. So you want, like Rich is saying, to render the page first, then read in the libraries. And for us, it's going to be, the effect is going to be almost imperceptible in terms of functionality, right? So that's why you do that.
So we haven't actually added any classes, but still if I go back and refresh my page now, we should notice a few changes with the fact we've linked to Bootstrap. What change is obvious now that we've linked? Even without applying any particular class, obviously a few of our HTML tags are affected by the style sheet. What do you notice that's different? Font's been default font's been changed.
Size.
Yep, size.
Buttons. List.
Yep, the button's a little different. Okay, the color's a little different as well. Now, one of the #1 ways, if you want to use Bootstrap but you don't want your site to look too much like Bootstrap, one of the primary things I would recommend is create your own style sheet and change the default font. Right? Because all the Bootstrap style sheet, all the fonts will be the same. So use a font other than, and if we want to know, okay, what font is this? Well, an easy way to check, if we just right-click and choose Inspect Element, we can actually see, perhaps here, so here's our color. So inherited from the body. I know it's a little hard to see. So Helvetica is the default Bootstrap font. Now, we can't change the Bootstrap file in this case because we didn't download it, right? We're linking to the file in the cloud on the CDN. So we can't make changes. If we want to make changes to the Bootstrap file directly, that's fine, but we have to download it and link to our file, make changes to that CSS file, and then we can use it locally. Or we can also add our own style sheet and link to that, and we can override the default body font if we want. So you have some options as to how you do it.
I want to interject one thing. So we talked about the CDN. The other option, like Rich talked about earlier, is downloading the actual CSS and JavaScript files. And you may want to do that if you're not connected to the internet and testing your stuff out, right? Because if you're not connected to the internet, there is no content delivery network. So you're on a train, a plane, you're in motion, you don't have access to a Wi-Fi or something, you probably want to download, as a developer, the local files, or CSS and your JavaScript. But the CDN is way better for a couple of reasons. From a production perspective, right? If other people have linked to the CDN before, they probably already cached the jQuery and the Bootstrap inside their browser, so it's going to load faster. So there's a performance gain from doing that as well.
Or to give you an example, I had a student come in the other day because he was working on a project and he's using Bootstrap, but the users of his web application, they're using iPads and they're taking them down into mines and quarries where they have no internet connection. So in his case, he's using Bootstrap for the CSS, but he needs to download the CSS and have those on his server locally to those files as opposed to using the CDN. Because when users open their iPads and go down into a mine, they have no internet connectivity. So the CSS isn't going to work if he's using the content delivery network. Now the other thing we want to add one other tag here in terms of responsiveness. We want to add another meta tag. We want this meta viewport. Is that right?
No.
Oh, sorry.
Can you do it?
Sure.
So
I never remember this off the top of my head.
I do. So name, again, is equal to viewport. That's what we want to put in. And content, this is what goes in if you have the extra library there, right? Is width is equal to device width. And for people who had me before, you know this one, right? And initial scale, right, is equal to 1. And the reason why we put this in is why? Why would I put this meta tag in there? What does it do, right? I'm going to go to D again because it's not listing. D, what do I put in this meta tag, this viewport tag?
The viewport.
Yeah, we talked about this before in our class
Oh
together.
yeah, it's a meta tag, and then its name equals to viewport, and
Yeah.
content equals to y equal
Width is equal to-
content and double quote,
Yeah,
and y equals to device,
Yeah.
and slash y, and comma, and initial scale, initial scale equals 1.
but why do we use it?
Yeah, what-
Why do we use it? Oh, that's a good question.
He knows the tag, but why do we use it?
What does this do?
Yeah.
I just know that meta is like something like a common set that common of my code. What are the code doing?
No, I want you to think about meta differently like that. Okay, so imagine we have two parts of our code. You learned this before in Intro to Web, right? There's the head and the body. Without the head, the body doesn't know what to do, right? The head controls the body. Anything we put in there, a meta tag is like a directive that tells the body to respond, to content in a certain way. That's why we indicate character set, char set, UTF-8. That's the character set type. And this other meta tag, this viewport, and when we specify width is equal to device width, we're actually saying the width variable. When we put it in CSS, we say width 80%. Well, our width is actually equal to device width. The width of the device, the viewport of the device, the width of the device, right? And then initial scale 1 means we want to scale it to the size of the device. So when I move my page from one viewport to another, it rescales and reflows the content, right, from, let's say, a desktop view into a tablet or a mobile view. That's why this is such an important meta tag.
So we're going to scale for device responsiveness.
That's right. That's the quick way of saying. See, Rich is good at summarizing well, right? So
Just less typing because I'm lazy.
it's awesome, right?
Right. So without that tag, that's going to help our site scale. It recognizes what device help us recognize what device we're on and scale appropriately. Okay.
So
If
dynamic scaling of the web page.
you got it. Okay. If I refresh, you don't see anything different here. It doesn't do anything, but that will help us detect the device we're on. So now let's try a few of the classes. Our nav bar is terrible. We don't want these bullets, and we don't want our links stacked. We want our nav bar to go across the page. So now we can start applying some of the classes. Well, how do you know what classes are in Bootstrap? If you're more of a developer and less of a designer, and like me, which probably most of you are, well, the easiest way to do it is on the Bootstrap site. If I go to examples and click Bootstrap theme, so this was that second CSS file, here you can actually see what different elements look like. So if I want to style something, typically I'll open this page. Oh, I want one of these yellow buttons. If I just right click and choose inspect element, well, the browser will show me, okay, this is called BTN warning. That's the class. So just by looking at their example page and using the browser tools, I can find out the class names of any element when I see something I want to use on my application. So, for example, we've got this nav. Okay, well, what if we want our nav to look like this? We want a black background. We want those links in white. We want them written horizontally across the page rather than stacked. And we don't want the little bulleted icons, right? We want our nav to look just like this. Well, I can just inspect it. So they didn't use a nav tag. That's okay. Here, class equals nav bar inverse. Well, we'll try that in our nav tag. First, we'll just say class equals nav. We'll see what that does. So we can apply multiple classes to the same element. And HTML will then pick up the properties of each class. So we'll start with this one. We'll give it a class of nav. Come back and refresh. Okay, that didn't do anything for us yet. Where was I? Oh, because it should be nav bar, not nav. Nav bar is the class we want to use. So this is largely trial and error. We'll use these every week, and soon we're going to start to know our way around some of the classes. Even for me, it's still a learning process, and I've been using Bootstrap for a while. So we'll give it a class of navbar. Okay, so we have a class of navbar. That didn't really change anything yet. We'll add this navbar inverse. That should give us a black background. So now we get a black background that spans the width of the page. Our links we're still going to need to modify because A, you can't read them, and B, they're still stacked and they still have the little bullet beside. So we're also going to want to apply a class to this UL tag, our unordered list. So if we apply a class here, and I think I'm going to guess on this one, I think if we give this one a class of nav and refresh, well, it's a little better. Our disks have gone away. We've got a rollover effect. Let's go back and see what they did. They called it navbar nav. I think that's the class we need on our list. There we go. Now we have proper looking navbar. I mean, do we need Bootstrap for this? No. Could you write your own navigation class and links to make them look however you want? Absolutely. But this will get the job done pretty quickly and easily. Okay.
One other thing I would probably do is surround the whole nav element with some kind of container class, right? So it depends on what you want. If you want your nav bar to stretch the whole screen, this is fine. But let's say for your form, let's actually put it there on the form. Yep. Right? I would go down to the form and then put in a div tag, let's say, which is a generic tag, right? With a class of container. Should be enough, right?
So container is another Bootstrap class. So I'll just wrap my form inside. It's one of the reasons I like Visual Studio. It automatically indents my HTML for me. Yeah. So I can see that the form is nested inside. So this should add a little bit of padding. So my form is not flush against the left side of the page now. Notice here it butts right up against the left. By using the container, we get a bit of padding around there. Yeah. And now the other thing I want to do is just set up our form a little bit. I want it to be stacked. We don't want it running across the page horizontally. We want username, username box, underneath password, password box, and then we want our login button. So we can add a few more classes. So what I'll do here, around my username, I'll put in a div and give it a class of form group, which is another built-in Bootstrap class. So when I save it that way, notice it wraps these in a section, and then we get it stacked vertically. So we're going to want a form group around the password, and then we'll want a separate div around the login button. That's not a form group because the form group is basically a label and then an input control.
So what are you noticing here? You're noticing that we have common elements, HTML5 elements, and we're using Bootstrap classes to, again, mark up those elements, right? And add the built-in classes from Bootstrap onto our page, right? To affect our page without us writing any CSS at all, right? That's really the magic of Bootstrap.
Yeah, we're just leveraging the CSS that's available to us in the cloud through the content delivery network. So we've got username and password wrapped. Now, there's a couple other things I want to do. I want to do two other things. What should we do with the login button? I would suggest there's two things we probably want to do with it.
Make it pretty.
Let's make it pretty. All right, well, we'll go back to the theme. So here are all the button classes in different sizes. What do you want the button to look like?
Danger.
Danger? Okay, so if I just inspect the element, here's my class, btn-danger. And we can also set the size of it. We'll leave the default size. So if we just put a class on our button, so btn for button and then btn-danger, that should make the button red with white text.
And it'll actually restyle the button a little bit bigger as well.
Yeah, and we can control the size. So if I refresh, yep, our button's bigger. We could make it smaller if we wanted to, and it's applied that class. We should probably do one other thing with the button.
Place it beside the form.
We could put it beside where exactly would be the best place for it to go. When you say beside, like you want it beside the password button?
Lower to the left. Sorry, right.
Well, we could put it at the bottom right. Any other suggestions of where it should go? Let's go here for a second. Let's just pick a login page. Let's go to Google. Right. Typically, we find the button immediately underneath, aligned nicely. So we want to align it underneath our two text boxes. The other thing about Bootstrap that I didn't mention, some of you who have worked with Bootstrap before, maybe someone can answer this question. How does Bootstrap manage positioning? So we can position elements, align them together. How does it do it?
They can make their own like margins and stuff like.
Yep, they have. Can you be a bit more specific?
I'll answer if you want. Oh, there we
Tyler?
go.
They have columns, so they go by 12.
Right. Bootstrap's come up with a 12-column grid.
Yeah.
So we can decide any element on our page. If we say it's 12 columns, it will span the entire page. If we say it's 6 columns, if we call it, I think the class is call left 6, it'll span the left side of the page. If we make it call right 6, it'll span the right side of the page. And we can see they've given us some simple examples here if we look at this. So here's how we use it. So if we want 3 equal columns, we'd create 3 columns, 3 divs, each one with a class of call, MD for medium sized, 4. If we wanted 3 unequal columns, our left and right columns, so let's say we wanted a left sidebar, a right sidebar, and a primary main content area that was half the page, and then a quarter. We'd use middle 3 for the left and right columns, middle 6 for that main panel. So it's completely flexible. And obviously you imagine if they have medium, yes, they have small, extra small, large, extra large. So we can play around, and they give you some different examples on different devices of how you might space those things out. So if we want these to align, we're going to need to use that column system to bump over the login button so that it aligns nicely with the edge of our boxes. Okay, so we'll want to wrap this inside a div so we can move it over a bit. Okay, so the pretty good examples. The other thing we're going to want to use, not only can we specify the width, but we can also specify the offset, which is what we want here, because we want to move this over and have it start here. We want a column or 2 of padding on the left before that button shows up. So how does this work? So what we'll do is in our form groups, we'll also maybe specify, actually I think we'll do it in here in our label. We'll make these all standard widths. We'll give our labels a class of call SM2. So 2 columns wide, because we might have a label that's longer. I'll add that to both my username and password label. So if I save it, that's going to push my text boxes off to the right a bit. It's going to make those labels, those columns that hold the labels, going to make them a little wider. Okay, so if I refresh, my boxes should move over to the right. Okay, so we've got some padding here now. So now we need to move this over. We want to offset it by 2 columns. So that if these take up 2 columns, the space before our login button also takes up 2 columns, and our login button shows up here in column 3. So we'll just wrap our submit button in a div, and we can give this one a class of call SM, this time offset 2, meaning 2 columns of padding on the left before we display this element. We'll see how that looks. Try to make it so you can see the code and the page at the same time. So there, now our login button's nicely aligned. We have 2 columns. So our labels are 2 columns wide. So the offset or padding before our button is also 2 columns wide. And that way the left edge of our boxes and our button align perfectly. So this is pretty simple. I mean, I could do this with regular and hand code all the CSS, but you guys would be asleep in bed tonight by the time I figured it out and made it look like this. Right? Using Bootstrap is much faster. We just have to learn our way around the classes a little bit. But this at least starts to look reasonably like a production level web application.
That's good. I would add a couple things, just really simple things, because if you want to, right now what Rich has done works, but if you were going to combine it with other things and from a column perspective, and to ensure that it's going to work like that, you want to put this, wrap all this thing into a row, right? So underneath the container class, add another div.
Okay.
And you want to make it with a class of row, right? And so what this does is says the stuff that we're looking at here, right, for column small 2, that we've specified, right? We want to make it inside one particular row. Now, when we do that, we may not want to wrap up the button all the time, because what that does is says all this is one row. It's all one row, right?
Okay.
But so sometimes it can mess you up if you don't have the form groups in there. But typically when we use columns to align stuff, we put them inside of a row container, right? So that way we can, if we have other rows, other stuff, content underneath that, then it'll flow in the same columns as these ones. How about this, one more thing. What if I wanted to move my links on the top of my nav bar to the right? My nav bar, you know, I don't like my links to my left. I want them to move to the right. Is there a quick and dirty way to do that? Well, float would be the way to do that, but Bootstrap has a class for that, right? Remember, we don't want to use any CSS coding whatsoever in this particular case. How do I use a Bootstrap class to move my nav bar items to the right? Hint, hint, to the right, right? What would it be? So if you go into your nav bar, right? And I want to say, if I say, I want to move it to the right, so there's 2 possibilities. In my head, I'm thinking right. So if I just put right in there, let's see what happens, right? Or is it nav bar right, right? One of the 2. Nav bar right? Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is. Try nav bar right.
Yep, so they stay on the left, but if I put in nav bar right.
Boom. Now here's what happens with the nav bar. And we know why this happens, right? It doesn't just do this, it shrunk the nav bar because we haven't contained our nav inside of a container at all, right? So if you put a container fluid to surround our nav bar, that might take care of that as well.
Dash fluid.
Yeah. And a fluid container has less margin on the right and left sides than a regular container. A container has more margin, right? And that still didn't do it. So there's something else we have to put in there to move it over And if you look at the navbar examples, that's what it'll do. So for now, just take it out,
Yeah.
because we don't want to mess them up. But that's what you would do if you want to move it to the right. Well, the container is okay.
Just apply it to the UL instead of that.
Is that what it is? Okay, there you
So
go.
we'll apply navbar right here.
Yeah,
Okay, I like that suggestion.
me too. And there we go.
There we go. So our nav bar still spans the whole page, but our links are on the right by applying that right class.
So that again, that saves you the trouble of understanding or coding your own, float right CSS, and it only affects the link that it's on, right, or the particular element that you're using.
So we will use Bootstrap in every class when we're building out Node application and building samples in class. We'll apply Bootstrap to it. So this would be a really easy way to get your CSS done for your portfolio. If you want to use other CSS, you want to write your own or use another framework, that's fine. This is kind of the industry standard and what we would suggest is the easiest, but the choice is up to you.
Guys, that's it for me. I'm taking off. See you next week, Rich.
Okay.
Thanks so much. And then on to Node, I guess.
Anybody have any questions about how we'd implement Bootstrap? Robert?
Could we start off by using this, and then when we go later on, we can make our own CSS afterwards based on what we...
Yep.
All right.
Yep, sure you could. The idea really is when you, the portfolio you hand in for the assignment is really the starting point. We assume this is going to evolve,
All right.
okay? That you'll do more work on it, that you give us something functional that looks good, that you could show in a job interview, but as you continue through the course and even beyond, you'll want to evolve it, right? Like even the portfolios I've shown you, even for people who graduate, it's still useful once you get your first job to have a portfolio, because you know what? You might not stay in that job. You might work there for a year or two and say, it's time to look for something else. Well, great, you already have a portfolio running on your domain name, hopefully. Well, now you can update it with all the stuff you've learned on your first job, the experience there. This should be kind of a living, breathing thing. We're kind of just giving you a start with. Do you have a question?
Yeah, is it like all open source? I was cited or...
Yep, it's all open source. Well, it's really cited. It's really cited right here, like just by linking to the CDN. That's fine.
Okay.
Okay. I know that it's Bootstrap, and you can use. You're free to use it. Okay. This is a good place for us to take a break. So it's time for us to dive into Node. So if you're on a lab computer, Node is already installed. Now, there were sort of two Node sites. There was Node.js.org and Node.io, which they have now merged. So you'll notice the version of Node that's installed on the lab machines is 0.12. And they've gone from that. The newest version is version 4.11. Now, how they did that exactly, I'm not sure. It doesn't really matter. So you can use Node on the machines. If you have your own machine and you've already installed Node, I would recommend you reinstall it so that you get the latest version. If you are working on your own laptop, how do you get Node? Well, you just go to nodejs.org and click the download link. Whoops, sorry. So go nodejs.org, click the download link. You can install the 64-bit version for Node. Is anybody here using a Mac? If you are using a Mac, then you'll want to install it using Homebrew. So this installs version 4.1.1. So how do we actually get into Node, find out if it's working? Well, the easiest thing is open a command prompt. Now, don't open the command prompt from the Programs menu. The easiest way to do this on Windows is click Start, and in your Run box, type CMD. You'll get a command prompt if you're on a Mac. You can open Terminal. And if we run the command node-v, this will tell us if Node is installed. If Node is not installed, we'll get an error. If it is installed, we're going to get the version that's currently running on the machine. So I've just installed the new version this morning, so I'm on version 4.1.1. If you're on the lab machine and you run this, it should say the version, I think, is 0.12.
Yeah, 12.6.
So that was actually the version previous to 4.1.1, believe it or not. Because they merged two different trees, basically, yeah. Be a good way of putting it. Okay. So when you open your command prompt, by default, you'll be in here on the lab machine. It'll be C users, I think GC student. If you're on a Mac, it'll be in your personal directory. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a directory called week 3. So the node files we make today will go in that directory. Okay? So I'm just going to, you can do this through Windows. I'm just going to run a make directory command. I'll call it week 3. And then I'll change directories. I'm now inside of my week 3 directory. If I do a directory command, I now have an empty folder called week 3.
Can you make it bigger?
You can't. All I can do is change the screen resolution, I guess. Hang on.
Magnifier.
I can't actually make the command prompt font any bigger. Better? Okay. So, and if I go into Windows, if I go into my users directory in Windows, here's my R Freeman directory. So here's my week 3 folder I just created from the command prompt. So I'll make a week 3, week 4, etc. folder every week and save all my files there. Okay. So I just did this through the command prompt. You can do it through the Windows directory structure if you want. But then you still need to open a command prompt because we're going to use this command prompt. So the very first thing we want to do with Node, we're going to make a single line, one-line JavaScript file, a hello world file, and we'll want to run that file, launch it from the command line. So in whatever code editor you used for your Bootstrap test, you can just use that for doing your JavaScript files as well. Whether you're using brackets, Notepad++, NetBeans, Visual Studio, doesn't matter. So I'm going to make a new file. I'm going to choose JavaScript file. All the files we build the rest of the day are going to be .js files. So this will be our first Node file. So all we want to do is log to the console, hello world. With a semicolon. And I'll save this in my week 3 folder that I just created. And we'll save this as hello world.js. Yes, our Node files are going to get a lot more complex. We'll walk before we can run. Ah, heck, we'll crawl before we can walk. This is crawling. So we've got a JavaScript file. All we need to do to run this JavaScript file, so it's saved inside my week 3 folder. I'm in my week 3 folder in the command prompt. So now if I type the command node hello world.js, we're going to use the Node compiler to run our JavaScript file. We're not even in the browser yet. So it executes our JavaScript down here, prints out hello world, prints out the contents of that log command. Okay? And it exits. Our cursor's flashing so I could run other commands. Right? I can. Now notice there is a compiler. Let's say I forget a single quote. Okay, I've opened my hello world. I mean, I like Visual Studio because it tells me what I've done wrong. But let's say I try and run my file this way. So if I try and run it, the Node compiler finds a syntax and it tells me we've got an error. The very last thing here is line 3. So that's the line number that our error occurred on. Okay, because we didn't terminate. So I can fix that and restart it one more time. Okay, so this showed up. Why? This tells you a lot about how Node's event loop. So why has line 22 executed, but the console.log on line 14 not executed?
Is it waiting for a signal from the browser?
Yeah, because we haven't made an HTTP request yet, right? I've launched the server, so this line happens no matter what. Line 14 only happens when an HTTP request has happened. Our server's running, it's active, but until I refresh it, there's no request made. So when I make the request by hitting refresh, now it logs to the console. Good question. I'm not sure why it's coming up twice, because it's only printing this once. I'll have to think about that question. I don't know.
Is it like a response? One for the request, one for the response.
It could be. That's a very interesting question. So you can sort of see how the event loop works, right? This only happens when there's a request, but our server's listening constantly, and that function gets invoked every time there's a request made to the server. That code runs. Whereas this code just runs once when we run the script file. Okay, I'm going to stop this one. So this syntax, I know it's a bit new. You've probably never passed a function as a parameter to another function before. I know in Java you've passed objects to functions. This is really the same thing. So instead of passing an object, we're passing one function as a parameter to another one. Not really that different from passing an object to a function. Any questions about what we're doing here so far? Normally, when we build our full-scale JavaScript applications, we're not going to write this HTTP server on every page, right? We don't want to have to create and start the server on every single page. This is the main part of the reason we're going to use Express. Express handles the server side for us. The creation and maintenance and running of a server. We don't want to put this in every page. We just want to call Express and let Express handle that part. But this is how we would do it based, in Node without using Express. We also talked about back a couple weeks ago, and again, you can sort of see this here. We talked about synchronous and asynchronous code, blocking and non-blocking. So you notice by writing my function this way, this code is asynchronous. That basically it doesn't execute, it waits until it's called. But it doesn't prevent this line from running, even though line 22 is in our script after that function. It can still execute, and then this function will run whenever a request comes in. So I want to try an example. What we want to do is write the same code. We're going to write two versions of the code. The first version is blocking, where each command executes in sequence. So the command 2 won't execute until command 1 finishes, then command 3, then command 4. Then we're going to write a similar version of the same thing, but we're going to use non-blocking or asynchronous code, so the commands just execute whenever they're ready. And we'll see the difference. So the first thing we need to do is create two quick text files. And we're going to read from those files and output. So just make a new file, choose a text file. In this text file, we just need a list of things. So what can we put? We'll have two separate lists. And these lists can be anything, it doesn't matter. So what should we be in our first list? Anything at all.
Vegetables.
All right, we'll have a list of vegetables. So give me a vegetable to go on our list.
Broccoli.
Okay. Sorry. So we've got broccoli, and on a new line we'll have potatoes. Anything else? Let's put a couple other items. Lettuce. Onions. All right, that's good. So we'll save this as vegetables.txt. We'll save it in our folder with our other files from today. Doesn't matter really what values you put in here. So I'll save that in my week 3 folder as vegetables. Now we need another text file. What should we put in our other text file? Fruit? Okay. So we'll make a new text file. I'll save it as fruit.txt. What fruit do you like?
Tomatoes.
Tomatoes? All right. Grapes. Let's put a few more in here. We'll make this list a bit longer. Good choice. I had an apple today. Any other fruit anybody's eaten today? We already got oranges. Okay. 2 more. Strawberries. All right, that's good. So our fruit list is quite a bit longer than our vegetable list. So what we were going to do is we're going to write a JavaScript file that will read from both of these and output them, but also output some messages. First, we're going to use blocking or synchronous code. Okay. So again, it doesn't really matter what values you have in here. If you have different number of items in the 2 lists, that's good, because that means reading those files will take different amounts of time. So let's make a new JavaScript file. I'm going to call this one so I'm going to save this one as blocking.js. So the first thing we'll want to do is link to the FS core module so we can read the 2 text files. Right? We've created these 2 text files on our file system. We want to read them. Well, there's different read methods in the file system library, so we're going to want to use that. So we'll create a variable called fs, and we'll require Node's file system module. So we'll read the fruit. So we'll create a variable called fruit, and we'll set it equal to our file system module has a method called read file sync. Sync meaning synchronous. So our code is blocking. Nothing can happen until we're done reading the file. Okay, so what file do we want to read? We want to read fruit.txt with, we have to specify the encoding, which is UTF-8. So if there's a million kinds of fruit in that file, no other code will execute until Node is done reading every line in that file. So now we want to output the fruit list and a message. So first we'll log out our fruit variable. Then we'll log out printing fruit. We then want to repeat the exact same process with our vegetable list. We'll then want to open the vegetable file. We'll want to read the list, close that file, print out the list of vegetables, and print a message. I think this morning we had pizza toppings and booze were our lists. So we'll read the vegetable file again synchronously. So it's blocking, so when line 14 executes, nothing else happens until the command on line 14 is completely finished. So we're not using HTTP. We'll just run this from the console, from the command prompt. We won't use the browser at all for this. So we'll log out the list of vegetables. So there's our blocking file. Done. What do you suppose this is going to display when we run it in the command prompt? Yes, it will. Robert?
All the fruit, volatile vegetables listed in the text file.
And what about our two messages that say printing fruit and printing vegetables? Where will they appear?
Directly after each one.
Okay, so you're saying it's going to print like our 10 fruits, then it will say printing fruit, then it will print our list of how many vegetables? We have 4 vegetables, and then at the bottom, the last line will say printing vegetables? Okay. Well, let's try it. So I'm going to run my node command. We'll call blocking.js. And based on my output, we can see that Robert was right. It reads the fruit file. It outputs that entire list. Then it outputs our message on line 11. We're printing the fruit. Then we open the vegetable file. We read it into a variable. We print out the whole contents of the vegetables. And then we print our message at the end. So this is blocking code. If you wrote a similar application in Java or C# or PHP, you're going to get this output in pretty much all the cases. Okay? The code executes and outputs things sequentially. Now, why is this potentially not great? You know, in that video I showed you from week 1, he discussed the disadvantage of this approach.
If you were trying to print out, say, an array of like thousands of data, that would end up going first and nothing else would load.
You got it, right? So these processes could take a long time. With blocking code, nothing else happens. We've got to wait for one process or command to finish before we can do something else. If we use non-blocking code, we can go ahead and print other things out to the screen while our file reading is happening. So we want to now rewrite this, but rather than using read file synchronous, which is blocking, we want to use asynchronous JavaScript functions to do it. Okay. So now we're going to create non-blocking.js, and we'll rewrite this and we can see how they behave differently. So I'm going to create one more JavaScript file. I'll save it as non-blocking.js. We're once again going to have to require the file system library. Without that, we can't read the text files. Okay, we need to make that reference. So read output fruit. Now there's a couple different ways we can do this. I'm going to show you the common Node syntax. Warning, it's going to look strange. It's kind of similar to what we did here, where we're using a function as parameter to another function. So we'll create a variable called fruit. Instead of calling read file sync, we're just going to call read file. So the default read file method in Node is asynchronous. It's not blocking. We still want to say we want to load fruit.txt. We still want UTF-8. But now what we need is to pass in an asynchronous callback function that takes two parameters. The first one is an error parameter. That's built into Node so that if an error happens, we can capture information about that error. The second parameter is actually the same as our variable. So in a way, this parameter is sort of self-populating. The same variable we're going to use to hold the output, we're passing in as our callback function. We'll talk a bit more about this. We'll finish the code here. So now inside of our function, we want to output the fruit list. So we'll just use console.log fruit. So by using our callback function, we've now made this code asynchronous. Read the file, and whenever it's done, go ahead and log the output. But it's written in a non-blocking way, so our code can carry on. In this way, this doesn't stop the execution of our page. So now if we do console.log printing fruit, we'll add the vegetables in a minute, but we can actually try the file this way. If we run the file like this, what do you expect we'll see in the command prompt? Tyler?
You'll see all the followed by printing fruit.
Okay, well, let's try it. So I'm going to now run my non-blocking.js. What happened? So because our call is asynchronous, notice our output, my line 11 executed first. Line 11 executed because while the file was being read into this variable, the execution continued. Then our execution was transferred back up here after to print the fruit. That's why this structure is known as a callback. Start some code, executing some code, then keep going. But whenever this is done, call the execution back here so it can do whatever it needs to do.
Is it putting fruit into an array or is it printing it one at a time?
It's basically putting it into an array. It reads the entire contents into that. If we do the same thing with our vegetables, so we're going to create a vegetables variable. Again, we're going to call read file, but this time we're going to read our vegetables. Now we can try this another way. So here we want to console.log our vegetables. And again, we've used an asynchronous function. So it's non-blocking. Our code can keep going, and it'll come back or get called back whenever it's finished. What do you think our output will be if we run it now?
Printing fruit, printing vegetables, fruit list, and then vegetable list.
Okay, so you think it's going to run this line, and then this line, then our list of fruit, then our list of vegetables.
Yeah.
Could be. Actually, it's interesting. The vegetables may even print first because that code is going to finish executing before this one. It could because there's only 4 vegetables and there's 10 items in the fruit. I don't know which one will execute. Nope. The fruit will still be first. Let's try it.